The Military-Industrial Complex, Part 1. Guest article by Berk. Gümüs. Excerpt from Satan's Drift. No. 77 RAND Corporation Operation Global Manipulation from 2018.
In London, near Buckingham Palace, there was a house known as Wellington House. It was there in 1913 that the War Propaganda Bureau was established, with the mission of breaking down the strong public opposition to the impending war between Britain and Germany. The British people were to be manipulated into agreeing to Britain's declaration of war on the German Empire. The project was financed by the British Crown and the Rothschilds. For this propaganda vehicle, Lord Northcliffe was previously married into the Rothschild family, who was a British journalist and publisher. The war-mongering is not a rarity. Even the ancient Romans used this tool. Eduard Bernays, born in 1891 in Vienna into a family that had produced many rabbis and scholars of Judaism, grew up in New York and deeply internalized the psychotheories of his uncle Sigmund Freud. He had managed the feat of driving the American public into the First World War with the argument that has since been constantly bandied about by people like George W. Bush: we want to make the world safe for democracy. Eduard Bernays had manipulated public opinion in the United States of America as strongly as no one before him, supported by Walter Lippmann, a son of German Jewish parents who also grew up in New York. The influential journalist and Pulitzer Prize winner coined the term gatekeeper and explained even then in what way the journalists become gatekeepers, and thus the instrument of a broad-based opinion manipulation. The gatekeepers would decide what to withhold from the public and what to promote. Every newspaper, when it reaches the reader, is the result of a whole series of selections. Bernays and Lippmann's clandestine connections to the real powers that were enormous, as can be seen from the fact that both rose to become influential advisors to President Woodrow Wilson at the young ages of 23 and 25. Woodrow Wilson was the first president to have a war, the First World War, managed by a civilian committee that was directed by Bernays and Lippmann. Walter Lippmann and Eduard Bernays were appointed by Wellington House to manipulate American public opinion. It is also interesting to note that when Woodrow Wilson initiated the creation of the Federal Reserve System, before the bill was sent to Wilson for his signature, a copy was sent to Colonel Mandell House, a representative of Wellington House, and to the banker J. Morgan, a representative of the British Olive Oil Company. J. Morgan was also the one who financed Nikola Tesla to build the so-called Wardenclyffe Tower, but this project was never completed because Morgan stopped financing it. Eduard Bernays said that propaganda was the executive arm of the invisible government, and this motto was taken to heart by British psychiatrist and later Brigadier General John Rawlings Rees when he founded the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations, TIHR, 3 years after the First World War. Officially, the year of the institution's founding is given as 1947, but in reality, the Tavistock leaders began their work much earlier, at that time at the Tavistock Clinic. In 1921, the indoctrination operations were transferred from Wellington House to the Tavistock Institute, where Rees further perfected the methods of mass brainwashing. In addition, he established his own research center for British foreign intelligence. It was Rees who developed the method of controlling political campaigns, as well as mind control techniques that are still used today. At the outbreak of World War II, he was placed in command of British Army psychiatry. The experiments begun at the Tavistock Institute eventually led to the secret MKULTR project of the American Intelligence Agency, the CIA, which will be explained in more detail later. Leading these experiments was the RAND Corporation, another creation of the Tavistock Institute. 441st Contact Saturday, 3rd February 2007, 12:02 a.m.
With the named group, it concerns a worldwide branching from governments, the military, industrial groups, secret services, paramilitary, and powerful ones of finance, as you correctly said. Those in the know and contributors are only certain elements of the same, who profit greatly, financially and power politically, from their secret machinations, for which reason the entire powers of the government, military, and industrial as well as finance are not involved in the situation and are also not informed in regard to this. The group is not organized, as such, rather is only a loose collection, whereby their interests, however, have a common form, which, already since the 1920s, was designed to operate a continuous, ingenious, larger-scale disinformation campaign regarding the question of extraterrestrial life.
The RAND Corporation is the most important and influential think tank in the history of the world. About 30 Nobel Prize winners have worked for this organization, who won their Nobel Prizes while working for RAND. Originally, the RAND Corporation was an offshoot of the IR force, which wanted to recreate the Manhattan Project. The Manhattan Project was a combination of civilian scientists and the military. Washington and the country's industry, General Motors, Ford, U.S. Steel, General Electric, recruited the so-called brightest minds from around the country for the Manhattan Project in 1942. From MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Princeton and Columbia University, who gave the world the radar, the fighter jet, and the atomic bomb. General Henry Harley Hap Arnold, a five-star general in the IR force, wanted to make sure after World War I that the same combination of civilian scientists and military know-how came together to develop new weapons. On March 1, 1946, Project RAND was launched, at the time still based at Douglas Aircraft Company, then the nation's largest aircraft manufacturer. But within 2 years, in 1948, Project RAND grew so large that it had to break away from Douglas Aircraft Company to become its own non-profit organization. Yet it was inextricably linked to the FOD Foundation, the robber barons like Carnegie, FOD, Rockefeller, and Rothschild. There was always a connection between think tanks and the big business interests. Special in the case of RAND, there was an inseparable connection to the FOD Foundation. For the lawyer who drafted the charter for RAND later became the first president of the FOD Foundation. Without Ford's funding, the RAND Corporation would never have gotten off the ground. The close relationship between FOD and RAND was the great economic interest in protecting their own interests and selling their goods worldwide. FOD wanted to make sure they would have consumers. The RAND Corporation served as a very useful complement to this capitalist outlook. One of RAND's first projects in 1946 was the development of orbiting satellite stations, which until then had only been seen in science fiction comics. But the scientists at RAND made this a reality, so much so that they even said what jet fuel should be used, what the weight-lift-off ratio and use for that satellite should be. The RAND Corporation was also very instrumental in the development of ballistic intercontinental ballistic missiles, the development of the hydrogen bomb, and the deployment, storage, and transportation of nuclear weapons. In the late 1950s, they sought a way to maintain communications in the event of a nuclear attack. A RAND computer scientist named Paul Barron developed the concept of packet switching, which became the foundation of the Internet. They were involved in the development of aircraft capable of refueling United States bombers in the air with another aircraft that would take off from the United States to bomb various targets in the Soviet Union. RAND was also responsible for the Seas subversion policy, holding the first counterinsurgency conference for Third World countries in the 1950s. They incited the military to stage overthrows, which were then also organized a short time later, for example, in Peru, Brazil, and Chile, which continue to this day.
Except from the media platform Voltaire Network of January 11, 2022.
The events unfolding in Kazakhstan for the past week are the fifth part of a plan by the RAND Corporation, the sixth of which will take place in Transnistria. The previous 4 episodes took place in Ukraine, Syria, Belarus, and Nagorno-Karabakh in the last 2 years. The idea is to weaken Russia by forcing it to deploy excessive troops. United States President Joe Biden responded to Russia's proposal for a treaty guaranteeing peace based on scrupulous adherence to the UN Charter and the given word during a telephone conversation with his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin on December 30, 2021. Not surprisingly, he did not respond to the content of Russia's request and only mentioned a possible halt to United States operations in Ukraine. At the same time, the United States National Security Council unleashed several actions against Russia. The goal is not to overthrow governments or start new wars, but to force Moscow to intervene outside its borders in a way that weakens itself. The Russian Federation already has a gigantic territory that it cannot fully manage with a population of only 150 million. In May 2019, the RAND Corporation, the think tank of the United States military-industrial complex, listed 6 options in this regard. 1. Arming Ukraine. 2. Increase in support for jihadists in Syria. 3. Promoting regime change in Belarus. 4. Exploiting tensions in the South Caucasus. 5. Reducing Russian influence in Central Asia. 6. Competing with the Russian presence in Transnistria. Washington, however, has now stopped preparing changeovers. After arming Ukraine, 1. Supporting jihadists in Syria. 2. Attempting 3. Regime change in Belarus. 5. Using tensions in the South Caucasus. 4. With Azerbaijani attack on Armenia. 6. Washington is now trying to reduce Moscow's influence in Kazakhstan. 5. And should soon compete with Russia in Transnistria. 6. In short, it is following the RAND Corporation plan. In 1960, R&D conducted the Vietcong study, which was sponsored by President Lyndon B. Johnson and Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. Robert McNamara was a United States executive and politician. In 1960, he became the first president of Ford Motor Company who was not from the Ford family. He was United States Secretary of Defense from 1961 to 1968 and President of the World Bank from 1968 to 1981. Commissioned on how best to defeat the Viet Cong. To conduct more detailed research, they authorized torture in Vietnam. Rand found that the Viet Cong would not give up because they wanted a better future for their children and for their country, and because they saw the United States as a colonial power, which it is, and were willing to die for their country. No one listened to them. In 1970, R&D applied the lessons they had learned in the War of the Field to urban planning, making New York City a laboratory experiment for its utopia of a perfect society. Until the 1970s, medical care was free in America. There were no deductibles. But President Nixon wanted to cut the amount the government spent on these services. He had R&D conduct an experiment, which in turn led to a charge for preventive care. Ronald Reagan's 1980s interventionist foreign policy led directly to R&D, while the Persian Gulf War, Operation Iraqi Freedom, and the reorganization of the Pentagon in so-called military affairs were all highlights of Rand's former employees' long-standing plans. Rand has also been involved in the militarization of the police, as well as conducting studies on the world's problems of hunger, war, drug smuggling, and even traffic congestion, and how best to eliminate these evils. Rand developed a worldview in the 1950s that would change the world forever. R&D consultant and economist Kenneth Arrow developed what became known as rational choice theory, which after its creation and expansion transformed United States citizens into consumers. Rational choice ostensibly began as a way to counter the Marxist doctrine of the Soviet Union. The United States needed to establish a theory that would legitimize the individualistic perspective on life that the United States and the Western world had always had. Instead of having rights and responsibilities, citizens became consumers with choices in a world where the only thing that mattered was the sovereignty of the consumer, how much money we spent, and what was in it for ourselves. This changed the whole consciousness of America, and with it the rest of the world. In the R&D Corporation they have the cult of reason, the belief that reason can solve all problems, and that there is nothing that reason can cure and fix. One of the main intellectuals of R&D was a man named John Williams. He was the head of the mathematics department, and he believed in preemptive nuclear attacks in the Soviet Union. He believed in creating a world government that would be run by technocrats like him and people like the so-called rulers of reason, which would be perfect if only that reason were controlled by ethics. Unfortunately, neither in the world of R&D nor in the world of the R&D Foundation was there much desire for an ethical view of life. Instead, it was to be a world that was all about efficiency. The people of R&D and of R&D thought that self-interest alone is what drives people. Of course, that is not the case. People love their families, they love their children, and sometimes they are even willing to sacrifice their lives for a person they don't even know. Principles like altruism, compassion, selflessness are denied by the rational choice theory. You can also say that humanity is denied by rational choice theory. There is no place for such a thing in their worldview.
Except from the book Soldiers of Reason, the RAND Corporation and the Rise of the American Empire by Alexa Bello, author May 2009.
John Williams owned a Jaguar coupe and replaced the engine with that of a Cadillac Behemoth, which caused him to race down the Pacific Coast Highway at over 240 km/h every midnight. He installed a radar device in this car, which was state-of-the-art at the time, so as not to get into trouble with the highway patrol. Williams often threw well-attended soirees at his home, and these parties were so distinguished that he and his brilliant guests got drunk and rolled around on the floor. This was a popular behavior among mathematicians who believed in the therapeutic effect of alcohol consumption. The famous Princeton University physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer was so loose with alcohol that the nickname of his house was Bourbon Manor. The economist John Nash developed the game theory, which sees man as a selfish animal that ruthlessly pursues its selfish goals. For the development of this theory, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1994. He also worked for a couple of years at the R&D Corporation. His life was even made into a movie called The Beautiful Mind, which was one of the two big winners of the 2002 Oscars with 4 awards, including Best Film of the Year. Because again, it all stems from the concept of reason without ethical guidelines, and that people only care about self-interest because the technocrats only look at life in terms of numbers and quantities. Game theory was developed as a way to find out what people would do under the most unknown situations, because they thought that people are always self-interested actors, and therefore it is rational to betray one's best friends in order to gain one's own advantages. R&D was proven wrong in the 1950s and 1960s during the Viet Cong study, when they discovered that the Viet Cong in Vietnam refused to act as rational actors. This was the first major experience R&D had in dealing with people who were not rational. The United States government said it was using rational choice theory in Vietnam by saying if we bomb the Viet Cong long enough and hard enough, they will eventually come to the negotiating table, because otherwise they will be wiped out. After a while, they realized that wasn't going to work because the Viet Cong, as I said, were standing up for something that was bigger than them. And that's why rational choice theory, rational self-interest, didn't work with these people. So R&D gave up using game theory as a predictor of human behavior because they realized that people are more than that. However, this has not stopped them from continuing to use this theory to transform citizens into consumers. Knowing that they can address this particular aspect of human nature, because after all, of course we have self-interest to a certain extent, but that is far from all that makes us human. Rand began a study in the 1950s of how vulnerable the United States was to Soviet surprise attacks that would destroy the entire country and its aircraft with all the nuclear weapons stationed in Europe. Based on a study prepared by one of Rand's chief intellectuals, Albert Wohlstetter, that changed the U.S. Air Force in 1953 by developing the nuclear strategy, the second strike capability, and how nuclear weapons were deployed and handled. The whole theory of second strike capability is that if you survive your enemy's attack and are still able to counterattack, that's what really counts. Better said, he taught the higher force to take revenge at any cost. He was also the one who fed the Kennedy camp information about the alleged missile gap in the 1970s to scare the American people into thinking that the Soviet Union was more powerful than it really was. Albert Wohlstetter was a United States political scientist and the founder of the new conservative movement in the United States, who paved the way for the development of the Star Wars SDI project, which was then endorsed by the Reagan administration in the 1980s. Among others, Paul Wolfowitz, Ahmed Al-Jalebi, and Zalmay Khalilzad had received their doctorates from Wohlstetter. Paul Wolfowitz is an American politician. He was president of the World Bank from 2005 to 2007. Previously, he served as a policy advisor to George W. Bush and as Deputy Secretary of Defense under Secretary Donald Rumsfeld. He orchestrated the war in Iraq and also worked one summer at the RAND Corporation. Ahmed Abdul Hadi Al-Jalabi was an Iraqi mathematics professor, politician, and chairman of the Iraqi National Congress, an Iraqi political party and former umbrella organization for various Iraqi opposition groups. Jalabi was George Bush's man in Iraq who prepared the invasion, and he was also the one who spread the rumor that Saddam Hussein was making bioweapons and nuclear bombs, which later proved to be false. Zalmay Khalilzad was the United States permanent representative to Afghanistan, Iraq, and most recently to the United Nations under the Bush administration. Prior to that, he was special advisor to the United States State Department for Afghanistan. From 1993 to 2000, Khalilzad was Director of Strategy, Doctrine and Force Structure at the RAND Corporation. The United States developed a plan in the 1960s that said it had a problem with the Soviet Union because there weren't enough American soldiers stationed in Western Europe. So they said they would simply drop several bombs on them to wipe them all out. The plan was called SIOP, Single Integrated Operation Plan, the plan to blow the Soviet Union to pieces, and not just the Soviet Union, but all of Eastern Europe, the whole Warsaw Pact alliance, and China while they were at it. Daniel Ellsberg, an economist with the RAND Corporation, who later became famous worldwide for the Pentagon Papers, was the one who was able to pressure Robert McNamara and the Kennedy administration to change this insane plan and to make sure that if there was a problem they would not simply try to wipe out the Soviet Union and the other countries mentioned. The first atomic bomb was dropped in Nagasaki in 1945, but no one really knew what to do with it. When the very first atomic bomb was dropped for testing in New Mexico, Alamogordo, no one knew what to expect. Some scientists took bets on whether the whole world would go up in flames or whether it would start a chain reaction and destroy the whole Earth. But once this weapon was developed and ready for use, they had to come up with a way to use it. Robert Oppenheimer was at first very proud of his creation, but later he regretted it. When he witnessed the first test explosion at Alamogordo in New Mexico on July 16, 1945, he had uttered the words Bhagavad Gita. According to the words of one of the central scriptures of Hinduism, where the god Vishnu appears equipped with multiple weapons and says, "Now I have become death, the destroyer of worlds." The RAND Corporation has always been about these what-if horror scenarios that basically said America could survive a nuclear war in the 1950s. RAND researchers like Herman Kahn served as the inspiration for the main character in Stanley Kubrick's film Dr. Strangelove. He really believed that it didn't matter because as long as, say, 10 million people survived the nuclear war, they would have won. Even if 90 million people died, it wouldn't matter because the other 10 million survivors would crawl out of hiding to recreate the world afterwards. When these plans were presented to President Eisenhower, he said that this was total nonsense, and there would not be enough shovels to scrape all the dead off the ground that they would have all over the country. But the people associated with RAND, the industrialists, wanted to make a lot of money from the development of these new weapons of destruction, so they kept pushing President Eisenhower to increase the Pentagon budget, but instead he cut it. R&D had always been associated with the heart of the Pentagon and with the financial predation that President Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex in his famous speech on January 17, 1961. So they went around and picked someone else who they knew would be much more malleable, and his name was John Fitzgerald Kennedy, who was in some ways a creation of the military-industrial complex, and therefore was assassinated primarily by the military-industrial complex. One of the founding fathers of R&D was also United States Air Force Chief of Staff General Curtis LeMay, who also served as a prototype for many generals in Stanley Kubrick's film Dr. Strangelove and was massively in favor of nuclear attacks against his enemies, whatever enemy America had at the time, such as the Soviet Union. General LeMay was constantly at odds with John Fitzgerald Kennedy. During the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, LeMay clashed massively with President John F. Kennedy and Defense Secretary Robert McNamara. He was strongly opposed to a naval blockade and instead called for a more aggressive posture toward the Soviet Union and Cuba, respectively. He argued that the United States should dare to fight a nuclear war against the Soviet Union while it could still win. The United States at that time had 17 times as many nuclear weapons as the Soviet Union and had conducted 10 times as many nuclear tests. He therefore pressed vigorously for permission to bomb the Soviet missile bases just stationed in Cuba. LeMay himself expected to be able to destroy only 90% of the positions. After the crisis was averted, extensive military analysis showed that LeMay would have achieved a far lower hit rate in the event of a first strike against the missile bases. As a result, this type of escalation would likely have led to nuclear weapons used on the Soviet side as well. Even immediately after the end of the crisis and the withdrawal of Soviet missiles from Cuba, LeMay continued to advocate an invasion of the island. When the assassination of John F. Kennedy occurred in Dallas on November 22, 1963, LeMay was vacationing in Canada but immediately returned to Washington and subsequently supervised the autopsy of Kennedy's body, with plenty of other people in the room to control Kennedy's autopsy at the National Naval Medical Center at Bethesda in Maryland. During the autopsy, the doctor told his intern that there was a lot of smoke in the room and that he could perform the autopsy properly, and that he should go tell them to stop smoking. The resident Paul O'Connor then went to the gallery of the autopsy room and saw General Curtis LeMay with a large cigar in his hand. When the resident asked him to put out the cigar, LeMay looked at him and blew the cigar smoke right in his face. So Paul O'Connor went back to the doctor and said that person was not going to put out his cigar. One of the reasons Kennedy came to the White House is that he said that America had a missile gap and that the Soviet Union had more missiles than the United States, which of course was a lie. Robert McNamara had to admit within the first few months of his inauguration that what they thought about the missile gap was not true and that the information was wrong. The information came from Albert Wohlstetter of the RAND Corporation, as I mentioned earlier. They had fed the information to the Kennedy camp so that Kennedy could go around and say, "The Russians are going to eat us for breakfast and wipe us all out."
256th Contact Monday, 13th May 1996, 1450.
Thank you. This information is sufficient for me. Is it possible to ask officially today how things unfolded in relation to John F. Kennedy, the 35th President of the United States of America, who was murdered in Dallas, Texas on 22 November 1963?
It was a plot of various interest groups, consisting of CIA, FBI, mafia, pro-Cubans, oil barons and the military-industrial complex. Lee Harvey Oswald and 3 other men collaborated with the alliance of conspirators, resulting in them insidiously shooting the U.S. president dead.
The most famous example of a false flag attack was the Tonkin incident. President Lyndon B. Johnson knew that the information he received about an attack by the North Vietnamese was completely false, but nevertheless he used that to go to Congress and authorize a resolution authorizing the deployment of American troops in Southeast Asia. There is also the Northwoods incident. The Pentagon again used a false flag to get the United States to launch an invasion of Cuba in 1962. This was before the October 1962 missile crisis, so it never happened. There are documents from RAND that suggested this false flag attack, as well as from the Pentagon and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. President Kennedy pushed the Northwoods Plan, which was a pretext to invade Cuba. These are the things that RAND has always considered. RAND developed a whole series of what-if scenarios. What do we do if this happens? What do we if that happens? And so on. But they never stop to ask themselves, is this the right thing to do? There is a total immorality in their plans and in their thinking. They are only there to advise and to propose alternatives. They are not there to tell the powerful that this is right and that is wrong. They called for nuclear attacks, with the plan that a certain city would be attacked and half of the population would die and the other half would die because of the nuclear fallout, and yet they pretend that their work has no ethical consequences. Many Russian newspapers called the RAND Corporation the advisors of death or the prophets of doom. Not only RAND acts in this way, but most think tanks. These people with their crazy brains are running around creating all these monsters that don't exist. The goal of the military-industrial complex has always been to come up with a bogeyman. They have to find an enemy to fight. For a long time it was the Soviet Union. Then it was China for a short time. Then 9/11 happened and it became the Middle East, respectively Islamic fascism, then Al-Qaeda, then the Taliban, and then the IS, and of course through all these years still Russia, China, and many others. It is as if this enemy keeps transforming itself, like the many-headed monster of Greek mythology, the Hydra. If you cut off one head, it grows two new ones. America's early allies suddenly became its worst enemies. They gave weapons to Saddam Hussein so he could fight Iran and invade Kuwait, but suddenly he became the enemy. The Americans invaded Iraq and just decided that he was the enemy from now on. And suddenly it will be your neighbor on the street who stands up for something that is not right and may not be allowed, as we are currently experiencing with the vaccinated and unvaccinated. The military-industrial complex is always looking for a new enemy so that he can build more weapons, make more money, and take more resources under the nail. This is a continuity that exists since the Napoleon War. If the enemy does not exist, then it is simply created. There is a group of people who manipulate others. They go so far as to be able to increase the budget of the Pentagon to produce more weapons and come up with an enemy to say, guys, this is our next enemy and we have to invade country X and stop the rebellion by taking over the whole country. And that country would then become a country of interest to American forces because there might be plutonium, uranium, oil, or something else that is in the national interest. And then all the attention will be on that country, and to pay for it, they will take the money out of the social services of education and so on that should be a benefit to the people, and not to fight an unnecessary war that is anyway only a pretext for the military-industrial complex to become even more powerful. The real enemy is right among us, but unfortunately few see this because they have fallen in love with their so-called kidnappers of consciousness and suffer from a Stockholm syndrome. RAND was called the shadow government because since the 1950s many people went from the RAND Corporation to the government, and then from the governments back to RAND and then back to the governments. It was a constant back and forth. RAND is the heaven of the military-industrial complex, and as the birthplace of the technocrat elite was involved in the formation and creation of the shadow government from the beginning, and they continue to be involved in such things. A number of these government and intelligence agency security clearances were issued to people who were at RAND. 50% of the work that goes out of RAND is for the federal government of America, and a lot of it is classified. People go from think tanks to governments, and from governments back to think tanks, then to the military-industrial complex, to companies that use their expertise to lobby the Pentagon for more weapons and the money they take out of social services, and so on, that are supposed to help people just to make their giant corporations even more monstrous. Andrew W. Marshall was an American foreign policy strategist who served as the director of the Office of Net Assessment of the United States Department of Defense from 1973 to 2015. From 1973 to 2015, every president had confirmed him in this post, such as Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, George H. W. Bush, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama. At the age of 89, he was still at the helm of the department, the oldest bureaucrat still in office, one of the original R&D scientists, and a good friend of Albert Wohlstetter. Andrew Marshall implemented the policies called the Revolution in Military Affairs, which accompanied Operation Iraqi Freedom and its predecessor, Operation Desert Storm. The war in Iraq was planned 20 years before Saddam Hussein, and the planners of it came, as mentioned, from the RAND Corporation. Andrew Marshall was the one who came up with the concept of guided missiles used during the Gulf War. Such missiles were able to flee around the bend and land in bunkers to explode. He invented the whole concept of cybercrime networks, and the whole concept of soldiers becoming virtual androids, going to war equipped with exoskeletons, not eating or sleeping for days, not feeling pain, seeing things from miles away, and so on. He championed the idea of always working on newer and better weapons to find better ways to defeat the enemy, with more money and more resources. Andrew Marshall and Albert Wohlstetter created strategies and study groups for the war of the future in the 1980s. America's motto of peace through force by preemptively attacking other countries to protect their interests and values was nothing more than the ancient Pax Romana used by Caesar Augustus to expand the power of Rome, a precept Paul Wolfowitz advocated when he proposed Pax America. The neoconservatives in the 1980s saw it as an old principle that America should determine the fate of the world. From his seat in the Office of Net Assessment, Andrew Marshall, as mentioned, increasingly called for the development of new weapons, while Albert Wohlstetter lobbied for legislative confirmations. They advocated, for example, the use of cyberspace weapons, mechanized techniques that could, for example, paralyze the enemy's computer system. They explored possibilities for mind-altering substances that could disorient soldiers in the field. Many of the leaders of the military-industrial complex during the 1980s became Albert Wohlstetter's and Andrew Marshall's followers. Even Donald Rumsfeld considered himself a disciple of Albert Wohlstetter. Donald Henry Rumsfeld was a United States politician from 1975 to 1977 in President Gerald Ford's cabinet, and from 2001 to 2006, George W. Bush's cabinet. He was Secretary of Defense of the United States. The Iraq War, organized by Rumsfeld, and his approval of torture methods during interrogations caused controversy. Between 1981 and 1986, Rumsfeld was chairman of the R&D Corporation. "We must prepare for war so that we may have peace," said the Roman Emperor Augustus, and Wohlstetter has always acted accordingly. Albert Wohlstetter's exhortations to prepare for disaster quickly led to a new generation of war planners and politicians, and brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. Paul Wolfowitz and Albert Wohlstetter were of Jewish descent, as were countless other influential R&D strategists who fiercely advocated Israel's interests with a strong interest in the Middle East. America's messianic role in the world and Zionism, which sees Israel's survival as necessary as humanity's survival, were beliefs encouraged by Albert Wohlstetter. Albert Wohlstetter was fascinated by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk and how he created the modern Turkish state. He saw it as a model for Iraq. The Middle East, with its vast oil reserves, became the focus of a well-coordinated plan to further expand America's power and to reshape the anti-Semitic countries. These plans were exactly what Albert Wohlstetter, Paul Wolfowitz and other R&D strategists had in mind and in their pro-Israel mentality. In the animal world, each animal must be constantly on the watch, otherwise he does not survive long. The technocrats are like animals gone wild, and have also turned the world into a kind of animal world, where everyone betrays everyone to gain their own profit. Therefore, the motto also applies to us humans, as in the animal world eternal vigilance is the price of freedom. Only that we humans do not defend ourselves most of the time with violence, but with our mind and our reason guided by ethical guidelines, respectful of the creative natural laws and commandments. Schöpferische Gesetze und Gebote.
66th Contact Wednesday, 10th November 1976, 2:18 p.m.
But now Liston Father has clarified the concerns about the mysterious events of the last months, because among other things they tried to kill you 3 times. The attacks themselves lead back to 2 different groups with completely different interests. The first attack was carried out by elements of a secret Israeli Christian religious command. Israeli Christian means that these are Christian forces in the Israeli state. The reason for this lies in the spread of the Talmud Emmanuel, whose first finder and translator, Isa Rashid, was found and killed by the same elements in Baghdad in March of this year. There is still a danger for you that this command will track you down in secret and try to carry out its will. So be very attentive and extremely careful. They have already once destroyed the truth, if it took thousands of years before it can now be brought anywhere. The worldly greed for might of the sects and religions is boundless, which is why every means will do for them to realize it. But you represent a danger to them, for your spreading of truth in general and especially about them, especially through the Talmud, very much endangers their belief and domineering plans. Beware, therefore, of the secretly burrowing religious ones.
717th Contact Wednesday, 6th October 2021, 9:32 p.m.
This happened because the who have their people even in the state leaders direct everything secretly.
So they really do rule and direct, consequently the rulers who are at the helm such as...
That is correct. There are also people who work as advisors, whose advice is then implemented by the advised state leaders, and the acquired wisdom of what they have been taught and advised by the advisors is dictatorially passed on to the population. These then usually follow everything without objection and have no idea that they are not being directed by the powerful people officially at the helm, but by advisors who in reality pursue completely different goals and are in turn dependent on those on whose behalf they work as advisors.
In that they then really govern precisely as a shadow government, but no one wants to admit that.
Yes, and this also includes those people who are from the American sect which also commits murders that are never solved because every murder is disguised as a suicide and judged as a suicide out of fear of the sect in its favor, or because the police and the judges guild themselves belong to the sect. As is the case especially in this is because the murder victims, on the one hand, know too much and, on the other hand, suddenly represent a danger to the organization. So these people who know too much and suddenly know too much are eliminated.
614th Contact Monday, 23rd February 2015, 2:03 p.m.
Look here, this fax was beamed to me by Marion because Willem watched the described film on television. This is a TV film about the OSS Secret Service of Scientology. I recently watched the film on 21 February together with Bernadette on television, which was released on 8 April 2014 but was shown on television on 21 February. It can also be borrowed, bought or viewed on the internet. What Marion faxed me, I copied from the internet. The following: the informers of Scientology, the sect's secret service OSA. ARD Doc Send determined. So February 21, 2015, 10:30 p.m.
The plot.
Scientology is one of the most controversial sects in the world. And yet even world stars like Tom Cruise and John Travolta follow the organization of founder Ron Hubbard. What is far less well known is that Scientology has its own secret service, the Office of Special Affairs, OSA, commanded by Scientology leader David Miscavige in Los Angeles. It is the oldest private secret service in the world and larger and more influential than the secret services of many states.